Welcome to Spotlight. The UN Human Rights Office has condemned the staggering number of civilians killed in Israel's war on Gaza, with women and children comprising nearly 70% of the thousands of fatalities it had managed to verify. The UN report on the human rights situation in Gaza detailed a vast array of violations of international law, warning that many could amount to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possibly even genocide. UNRWA says an average of 67 children are killed in Gaza every day. Meanwhile, the United Nations has also warned about the deteriorating situation in northern Gaza. It says Israel's military is preventing food and water from entering the besieged area, where an estimated 95,000 Palestinians are trapped and are in dire need of supplies for their survival. Here are our guests for tonight's show. Spokesperson for the Masar Badil movement, Khalid Barakat, joining us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. And also we have journalist, activist, and director of Palestine Aid Belfast, Fra Hughes, joining us from Belfast for the horrific violations and possible atrocity crimes in Gaza. What good are all these warnings and condemnations when no action is being taken? Prior to this recent report, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights said Israel's practices could amount to atrocity crimes and it may expand to crimes against humanity. Well, it has.
Yes, well, you could say that words without action is rhetoric, and that's what we're listening to. Rhetoric from the UN, rhetoric from the EU, and rhetoric from the American administration, from genocidal Joe Biden. People who on one level claim to say they want to see a ceasefire, they want to see peace, they want to see an end to the death, the violence, and the conflict within the region. At the same time, they're supplying political cover, they're supplying weapons, and they're supplying finance in order to keep the apartheid racist regime in Tel Aviv in place. I think it's important to see the conflict, if I could maybe use that word. I know it's a genocidal war on Gaza, and increasingly we can see that in the West Bank and against Lebanon. And I believe that there is a law that is either being passed or is being pursued in the Knesset, where people who are in Palestinians living in historic Palestine pre-1948, they have relatives in Gaza who are believed to be members of the resistance, that they will be expelled from Gaza, from historic Palestine. So what we're seeing is the legislation potentially already being put in place to, first of all, they've tried to annihilate the people in Gaza. They are destroying the West Bank as we speak. They are attacking Lebanon in a barbaric and unconscionable manner, with the huge loss of civilian life and infrastructure being mirrored in Lebanon, as has been done in Gaza. So they're putting in place plans for the total expulsion of the Palestinian people from pre-1948 Palestine. Now, I've always described what's happening in Israel as a colonial apartheid state. It is a Western imperialist footprint within the Ummah, within West Asia, and it is there to divide the Ummah. It is there to put sovereign nations against each other, nations that should actually have more in common than they have to divide them. And if you look at North America, we're talking about ethnic cleansing in Gaza. We're talking about genocide. We're talking about starvation being used as a means of war, as a method of subjugation, and as a method of ethnic cleansing in the north of Gaza. It's not that long ago, people were mentioning 300,000 people in northern Gaza who were suffering from food insecurity, which is the starvation that the Israelis are bringing upon the civilian population. That's now down to 100,000. They're herding people in Gaza like cattle. They're using tanks, they're using airplanes, they're using artillery, and they're using their navy in order to corral people into smaller and smaller, more densely populated pockets of internally displaced refugees, all easier to drop a £2,000 or a £5,000 bomb on top of people living in tents.
Right, Mr. Brown, as Israel flattens and demolishes Gaza, and has murdered over 43,000 Palestinians. The same is happening now in Lebanon. What has to happen for the collective international community to take action and stop these massacres? And in your opinion, where does this leave the credibility of international bodies such as the UN, which have failed the Palestinians and are now failing the Lebanese people as well?
Well, I think if you believe the Lancet, which is the British Medical Association publication, several months ago they claimed that there are possibly 140,000 Palestinians dead, between people who are missing, people underneath the rubble, people who have disappeared. So if 140,000 deaths in Gaza is not enough to stop the world watching and not intervening, I'm not too sure what will. I mean, there's no magic figure here where if it hits 50,000, all of a sudden the world's going to step in, or God forbid, you know, it hits 100,000, 200,000, 300,000, that they allow 90,000 people in northern Gaza to starve to death before anyone comes to their aid. I believe that the only people who really can have a solid effect upon what's happening in Israel is firstly the Americans. This is an American war. These are American bombs. These are American fighter jets. These are American ships that are being sold or passed on to the Zionist, racist, fascist regime to be used to decimate Gaza and to be a wider threat to the wider region. Israel wants to become it's supposed to be the fourth biggest army in the world. It wants to be the superpower in the region. It wants to destroy any regime that is a bulwark against Zionism. And that started with Iraq. They went on to Libya. They went on to Syria. They now have Iran and Lebanon again in their sights. So the world is doing nothing. I thought potentially maybe the Russians or the Chinese and BRICS, because that's going to be the future of this multipolar world that we're all praying will come into being as soon as possible and be as strong as soon as possible. But in the short term, so long as the Americans and the EU continue to support this racist regime in Tel Aviv, there will be no end to the deaths. There will be no end to the destruction. There will be no end to the famine. There will be no end to the refusal to allow in medicine, clean water. The vaccines that they've allowed in, a part of me wonders, if they're bombing Palestinians and the people in Gaza every day and they've murdered maybe 150,000, I couldn't even understand why they let that vaccine in, unless, of course, there's something potentially in the vaccine other than the polio vaccine itself, which is something that I would personally be concerned about. But it's true that Israel is a colonial state. It wants to displace and then replace the indigenous population. And they're doing that through a campaign of murder, bombing and mayhem. The UN is useless because it was set up, as we all know, after the Second World War. It replaced the League of Nations. It has the 6 permanent members of the Security Council, which is Britain, America, France, Germany, China and Russia. And when you have France, Germany, America and Britain as 4 permanent members of that council, they are always going to support Israel because it is a colonial state and they are all former colonial empires. And they stand by each other and they stand by the genocide that they committed in the past and are watching happen today.
Mr. Barakat, the elephant in the room, and that's the new U.S. president, well, the president-elect, the incoming president. Will a new U.S. administration make a difference in the current situation in West Asia? Or rephrasing that question would be, what kind of impact will a new U.S. administration have, given the fact that no matter all the differences that the 2 main U.S. political parties have, they're always on the same page when it comes to their obedience towards the Zionist lobbies?
Yes, I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump. I mean, this is a man who murdered Qasem Soleimani. This is a man who stepped away from the JCPOA agreement with Iran over the nuclear energy program. But outside of that, he didn't start any wars for the 4 years he was there. He is pro-Zionist, 100%. He did bring about the Abraham Accords, and he does seem to have financial interests within Israel and through his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. I think the important thing is I've always seen Donald Trump not as a politician. Now, he's the elected president of America, but he's not a politician. He's a man with a business background. He sees an issue, he sees a problem, he wants to sit around a negotiating table and bring some form of resolution to the problems. Now, he said he's going to end the war in Ukraine, which I believe he will do. He simply tells Zelensky to sit down around the table with the Russians, maybe go back to the Minsk 1 or 2 agreements that were falsely ratified by the Americans and, the Germans and the French, who said they would be brokers of that. And all that time during that process, they were actually deceiving the Russians and rearming the Ukrainians. He said in one of his hustings before his election, in one of the swing states, I think it was Michigan, he told the Palestinian Arab Muslim electorate that he would bring an end to the wars and he would bring peace to the region. Now, whether or not he's allowed to do that is a completely separate issue, because the deep state in America, they simply go to him and say, Mr. President, this isn't possible. What do you want to do? But I believe that Harris would have continued with genocidal Joe Biden's actions against the Palestinians and Iran and Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. And I think Donald Trump, I'm hoping he will come in and say, enough's enough, end the war, and tell Netanyahu, if Netanyahu's still in power come January, because that's beginning to look increasingly unlikely, that his time's up.
Thanks a lot, gentlemen. That's all the time we have for tonight's show. Spokesperson of the Masr Battle Movement, Khalid Barakat, joining us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. And thanks to Frau Hughes, journalist, activist, and director of Palestine Aid Belfast, joining us from Belfast. And also special thanks to your viewers for staying with us on tonight's Spotlight. It's good night for now, and see you next time.